The moment my boss opened that color-coded folder in the legal department, his face went completely white. The folder was thick with printouts he had assumed no one was keeping. 6 months of contracts with altered figures, bank transfers that led to shell accounts, approval stamps that didn't match the signatures on file. Everything was organized by date, cross-referenced by dollar amount, and backed up in 3 separate locations I controlled. He turned toward me, as if surprised the world still had room for surprise. He mouthed that I'd been tracking everything. I smiled and let the documentation answer for me. My name is Liz Truman. For 8 years, I worked in procurement for Reveltech, a mid-sized firm that traded in industrial automation. I liked systems because they were honest. Processes either worked or they failed. And when they failed, they left traces. I believed in tracing. What I did not expect when I started keeping careful records in the margins of my day was that those traces would eventually become the architecture of accountability. This begins with a budget line. It began quiet, the way corruption usually begins. An odd invoice here, a hastily approved vendor there. Little nudges at the seams of procedures. My job was to vet vendors and track payments. I liked the clarity. Orders, confirmations, receipts, every item an echo of a transaction. But over a few months, something gnawed at that clarity. Numbers behaved like actors reading different scripts. A purchase order would match a delivery note that didn't exist. An invoice would be stamped paid with a check run I could not reconcile. I am administrative in temperament, impatient with theatrics, loyal to templates. When the pattern emerged, I did what I always do. I began to document. I kept copies, exported metadata, and stored raw files in places I owned. I worked within policy when it was safe to do so, and outside of it when safety meant burying truth. For the first month, my notes were small things: screenshots, file dates, version histories. I labeled them with simple neutral tags: vendor_A_inconsistency, P01378_ mismatch. I kept the work to myself and to one colleague I trusted in finance, a cautious presence who wanted proof rather than speculation. We compared notes over late coffee and found ourselves building the outlines of a story neither of us wanted to tell out loud. The second month, everything intensified. A vendor that had once supplied small electrical components suddenly billed for custom assemblies at premium rates. A supposed expedite fee appeared on several invoices, always with the same routing code that skirted procurement oversight. The accountant I trusted found an odd trail in the payments ledger. Transfers routed through intermediary accounts, flagged internally as contractor reimbursements, but with beneficiary names that didn't match any contractor on record. The math described a siphon. Good evidence needs 3 qualities: provenance, redundancy, and time-stamped consistency. I built that infrastructure. Whenever I acquired a file, I exported the metadata and made 2 independent copies, one encrypted and personal, another on a secure air-gapped drive kept off-site. I created a third mirror in a cloud account registered under a professional alias I controlled. Redundancy protects against human vulnerabilities, deleted files, coerced deletions, or the casual incompetence of a person ordered to tidy up an inconvenient folder. I also learned how to read what electronic systems didn't say openly. Document metadata is a kind of handwriting. Creation timestamps, last modified entries, and user IDs tell a story no one can fully rewrite without leaving a residue. A forged approval stamp may look convincing on the PDF, but the signature's font history, the approving user's login session, and the certificate chain can give it away. I didn't hack systems. I read them like a linguist reads grammar. The third month deepened the proof. A pattern emerged linking 3 expense categories: emergency contractor fees, expedited shipping, and consultation services. Each category had a core group of invoices that funneled to the same set of shell companies. Those shell companies traced back to nominee directors, and a thin trail of leaked emails tied one of those nominees to an individual who happened to be listed as a contact within my boss's personal network. The network diagram looked like a spiderweb. The extra fee items added up into a meaningful sum, pockets of unauthorized payments that, when aggregated, completed the picture. I did not publish the pattern. I tested it. I made queries across the ERP system, toggled the filters to see how robust the cluster was, and asked my finance friend to do the same independently. He responded with the kind of quiet confirmation that matters less than the decision it pushed me toward. Keep the data, expand the chain, and do not go public until you have iron. There were moments of doubt. One late night, I almost deleted the archives. Evidence becomes a burden if you let it fester without direction. I thought about anonymity, about the cost of being the person who points the finger. I thought about ruin. But the data kept telling me the same story. The ledger did not care about the consequences to the teller. It showed me what it had stored. That ethical obligation became the lodestar. By month 4, I had constructed a timeline that threaded purchases to dates of authorization and then to outbound transfers. I could show, day by day, the moment an approval entered the system, the ledger entry to pay, and the corresponding bank routing that completed the transfer. I also found a sequence of internal memos that had been archived on the local drive, but not moved to the central document management system. Those memos contained narrative language praising agility and trusting judgment, the kind of language that executives use to justify exceptions. It was an institutional blessing for lawless practice. The 5th month taught me something workforce managers know only when they've been burned. Complexity protects fraud. The more moving parts you can point to, the more departments involved, the more exceptions justified, the more ad hoc decisions memorialized as urgent, the less likely anyone is to notice a small leak. So I simplified. I stripped the story back to essentials. I prepared a packet that would read like a legal brief, a chronology, source files for each claim, a reconciled ledger detail, and a mapping of beneficiary accounts. I labeled the packet not with accusations, but with the language of evidence, timestamps, hash values, and custody chains. I also planned the handoff. Evidence without chain of custody is vulnerable. If a file leaves an informal folder and later appears in the wild, defenders can claim fabrication. I chose 3 points of custody. First, an encrypted thumb drive locked in a safety deposit box. Second, an encrypted cloud archive with time-stamped access logs. Third, a physical printout delivered to a trusted third party, an outside lawyer whose reputation for independence I verified ahead of time. I wanted to ensure that the material could be authenticated, even if someone wiped the internal system or coerced people to sign false affidavits. Week by week, the packet gained density. I cross-indexed each item so that any auditor could follow a single dollar from invoice to bank transfer. I created a simple protocol for verification. Begin at the PO, cross-check with delivery logs, match the invoice, verify the approval signature, and then reconcile with the payment ledger and bank confirmation. Where the chain broke, that was where the theft had occurred. The day I decided to present the folder to legal, I felt the rare mixture of fear and clarity that arrives just before a necessary rupture. I bought a color folder, tabbed sections in bright colors, and made sure everything was legible. No redactions, no editorializing. I wanted transparency, not drama. My aim was not to incite gossip, but to demand institutional accountability. At 9 a.m, I walked into legal with the folder in hand. The department was quiet, papers stacked in careful columns, a small hum of printers in the background. Legal took the folder without spectacle, scanned the table of contents, and called their head of compliance into the room. The compliance officer read the first page, then the 5th, and his brow tightened in that particular way professionals do when the dots align and the reality behind them is final. My boss's colour drained as I slid the folder across the table. He had expected the comfort of obscurity. He had calculated invisibility into his arithmetic. He had not considered that methodical observation could become a weapon of sort, or rather, a mirror. He had never anticipated that procedure, the same procedure he exploited to bury errors, would be the path to his undoing. He fumbled, then argued about context, about the need for rapid action, about supply chain exigencies that required flexibility. His voice was steady at first, then smaller as legal began to test the chain. For those minutes, I watched a man who relied on institutional blindness confront the limits of that blindness. It was not spectacle. It was the procedural unspooling of a life built on exceptions. Legal did what legal does. They documented. They catalogued each file in my packet into an evidence index. They initiated a formal chain of custody, signed timestamp receipts for each copy, and initiated a parallel forensic review. My backups were verified against hash values. Files were uploaded to Council's secure review platform. The red flags in my spreadsheet translated into legal terminology: misappropriation, false invoicing, forgery. What followed was a slow, surgical process that felt like surgery from the inside. Meetings with compliance, interviews with finance, restricted access to certain drives, and an audit that extended into the boardroom. The company moved with procedural correctness because it had to. Procedures protect institutions as much as individuals, and once the machine was in motion, it could not be easily stopped. The board was informed under the rubric of fiduciary risk. That was the language that compels attention. When the chair read a summary of the initial findings, the room shifted like tectonic plates. Investors had to be notified if the investigation might affect performance metrics. An external forensic accountant was contracted. The company engaged a law firm experienced in internal investigations. There was no spectacle, only a chain of consequences that law and governance make inevitable once documentation is complete. Calm can be unnerving. I maintained it because the alternative, emotion, made argument easier for defenders. If you are the keeper of evidence, the enemy's strategy is to outpace you with noise. So I let silence do the heavy lifting. I answered factual questions with more fact. I did not embellish. I did not moralize. The work of documentation is not passion. It is clarity. Phase 2 of the work was to preserve personal safety and professional credibility. Accusing an executive is not an action to be taken lightly. Reprisals are real. People can be creative in vengeance, and institutions can be blunt instruments. I quietly told only a handful of people what I was doing. An outside employment lawyer I trusted, the finance friend who had verified the payment trails, and one senior HR colleague who took privacy seriously. Others noticed changes without knowing why. Rumors circulated. I rode them like a thread and kept attention on process. Weeks passed. The forensic review validated the chain I had prepared. The external accountant confirmed the pattern of diverted funds. The shell companies were linked via nominee directors, and the wire transfers could be traced beyond the domestic banks to intermediary accounts. Where the chain led overseas, it led to structures designed to obscure ownership, exactly the architecture one expects when intent is present. Each confirmation hardened the legal case. At the same time, the company made governance decisions. They froze accounts implicated in the review and put holds on executive approvals. They issued a notice to employees, a general, carefully worded memo about enhanced compliance procedures. That memo acted as a prophylactic, enough transparency to prevent panic, but not enough detail to inflame. It is a standard tactic. Normalize control before scandal breaks, because the public appetite for chaos is large and litigation is expensive. Then the calendar turned toward a board meeting where the full scope of findings would be presented. I did not have a seat at that table. That was by design. Evidence presented to a board must be treated with strict protocols. I sat in a small meeting room with legal, watching the video feed. The board members listened as counsel walked through the chronology, the invoices, and the bank reconciliations. I watched faces change. People who have been comfortable in ambiguity suddenly sought clarity. When the counsel recommended suspension pending criminal referral, the motion passed with a mix of resignation and relief. My boss was suspended that afternoon. He left with a face like a man who had been stripped of a role he had made indistinguishable from identity. No dramatic exit, just custody of consequences. I was not present for his removal. I did not want the emotional theatre. My work was not revenge. It was the quiet restoration of rule. The legal processes moved outward from there. The company engaged with regulators, and the forensic teams worked through bank records with investigators. Sometimes progress was a simple confirmation of the obvious. A payment labelled as a contractor disbursement routed to a shell company with no legitimate activity. Sometimes progress was complex, linking phone numbers, email headers, and IP addresses to show the communications that coordinated the transfers. The technical pieces piled like building blocks into a case that could not be dismissed as clerical error. There were collateral effects. People were shaken. Legacy relationships strained under suspicion. Senior managers requested proofs of their own approvals, wanting their reputations cleared. Some were exonerated quickly. Their signatures were real, their approvals justified. Others found paper trails that raised questions, and the circle widened. Fraud rarely occurs in a vacuum. It tends to have a gravity well that distorts nearby judgment. As the investigation extended, I made sure my documentation was available to the appropriate bodies in a way that respected legal protocols. I provided access to the external counsel and followed requests for additional exports. I answered questions accurately, and again, I avoided rhetoric. Documents do not need persuasion if they are complete and commensurate with the allegations. It took months for the company to complete its internal process and hand materials over to law enforcement. Those months spelled a new kind of tension. I kept working, continuing my duties in procurement, but every morning felt like a checkpoint. Some colleagues avoided me out of discomfort. Others offered quiet expressions of gratitude. I learned to carry such a tension without letting it define me. Eventually, the case reached criminal referral. The local prosecutor's office opened an investigation based on the evidence. The bank cooperation yielded further trace data, and the picture of culpability sharpened. Charges were filed. I did not attend court. That was not my role. My role had been to make sure the record was clear and resilient, not to play protagonist on a public stage. After the referral, the company moved to recover funds through civil channels where possible. They negotiated freezes on accounts and sought restitution via asset tracing. Not all money returned. The architecture of transnational obfuscation exacts a toll. Still, significant funds were recovered, and restitution agreements were part of the civil settlements that followed. The reputational and cultural consequences of the episode were more enduring than the monetary ones. The company replaced certain executive roles, restructured approval thresholds, and implemented a range of technical controls: dual authentication for payments above a set threshold, immutable ledgers for invoice approvals, and mandatory second-party sign-offs for expedited fees. They adopted a policy of open auditability, not theatrically public, but functionally transparent to the appropriate oversight teams. The systems that had allowed ambiguity were replaced by clear processes. What had been tolerated as flexibility was now framed as a governance weakness to be eliminated. Once the immediate crisis resolved, I took time to reassess. I had expected to be consumed by relief. Instead, I felt an odd combination of fatigue and guarded satisfaction. The work of documenting is both meticulous and lonely. It requires detachment and a willingness to behave like an archivist of truth. It is not literary, it is utilitarian. But utility, in this case, mattered more than applause. There was an emotional aftermath too. People asked whether exposing the fraud had been worth the professional cost. I answered that question in the only way I could, by continuing to do the job with integrity. My career adjusted, but it did not collapse. Some doors closed, others opened. Over time, I found new responsibilities, particularly in designing controls and in advising on procurement policies. The board asked me to lead a small internal integrity working group. I accepted, not out of ambition, but to make sure the lesson that had been learned was institutionalized. One small measure of change struck me months later. A junior procurement analyst, who had once been afraid to flag anomalies, came to me with a folder and asked how to document irregularities. He did not want a hero's narrative. He wanted protocol. He wanted to know how to make evidence durable. I sat with him and walked him through what I had done, not for glory, but to ensure someone else could replicate the path if needed. Teaching method is a quieter kind of safeguard. There were public consequences as well. The company issued a statement about enhanced compliance, framed as a proactive improvement rather than a reactive remedy. Investors were placated with assurances about governance reforms. The media covered the investigation in clinical terms. In private, a few commentators wondered whether the episode would make the company more resilient or just more cautious. I hoped for resilience. There is an ethical calculus that sits with people who document wrongdoing. Some say surveillance breeds mistrust. I understand that argument. The same systems that protect can be used to police. My choice was specific and targeted. I built a record not to watch colleagues, but to guard against abuses that, if left unchecked, would corrode the organization. Looking back, the remarkable thing was not that deception existed. That is almost inevitable when human systems touch money. But that procedure exposed it. The same bureaucratic structures that fraudsters exploit, purchase orders, approvals, memos, also provide the paper trail that disciplinary systems require. The trick is not to distrust systems. It is to insist that systems be complete and verifiable. In the quieter months after everything settled, I maintained my backups. I kept 3 copies, as a ritual and as protection. I revisited the archive not out of nostalgia, but with a practical insistence. Evidence must be kept until the statute of limitations passes and until an organization can attest that structures have changed enough that similar abuses are harder to pull off. That attention had impacts on my life outside the office as well. The stress took an emotional toll, sleeplessness, moments of irrational anger, a sense of vulnerability that felt personal, even when the work was public. I added small rituals to offset that tension. Long runs early in the morning, a rotating set of books I returned to when clarity waned, and conversations with a therapist who helped me keep perspective. Documenting the system's misdeeds does not make a person immune to the personal costs of exposure. The man who had been my boss faced legal consequences and professional exile. He appealed and argued and explained, as people who lose power often do. The law processed his defenses and weighed them against evidence that no human recollection could change. His life forward would be different. The structure he had layered around himself had collapsed under the weight of documentation he hadn't considered. For my part, I continued to build structures that favored truth, more robust procurement workflows, capacity for third-party verification, and training for teams in how to preserve metadata without paranoia. The organization moved from being comfortable with exceptions to being committed to accountability. That shift will not erase the past, but it reduces the chances of recurrence. People sometimes ask whether they should step forward when they suspect wrongdoing. My answer is process. The first duty is to verify, not to accuse. Build a record. Find one person who will read it and ask questions. If the evidence suggests malfeasance, wrap it in custody. Legal systems are designed for evidence, not for drama. Chaos is a fraudster's ally. Calm is a whistleblower's repertory. My final act with regard to the folder that started it all was small and symbolic. I requested that legal retain one copy in their evidentiary archive and that another remain in the company's secure compliance vault, accessible to the Oversight Committee for a fixed retention period. The last copy I kept, encrypted, sealed, and dated, was a reminder to myself that documentation must live beyond immediate crises. I do not narrate this tale as a triumph of the individual. It was the triumph of structures doing what they are designed to do: record, preserve, and resist the impulse to smooth over uncomfortable truths. People who work in procurement, compliance, and finance are custodians of trust. Their instruments, ledgers, purchase orders, audit trails are blunt but reliable. They will never be glamorous, but they are the backbone of institutions that survive. When the dust finally settled and the legal teams archived their files, I returned to my desk and resumed normal work. Procurement needed attention, contracts required negotiation, and vendors needed evaluation. The day-to-day work of a company does not stop for scandal. It continues because the clients depend on order. My work was to ensure that order had integrity. There is a quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing a system restored rather than from watching a person punished. I would have preferred a world where mistakes are mistakes and malfeasance is rare. But reality is not ideal. In the end, I took comfort in the procedural fact that documentation matters. Evidence keeps institutions honest because truth is the only thing that remains when stories fray. Months later, when a junior colleague asked why I had not gone public, I said what I believe. The purpose of exposure is correction, not spectacle. The goal is to make behavior harder to repeat, to make systems more transparent, and to protect those who do the work without recognition. That is both the least dramatic and the most effective kind of justice. The folder remains in legal's vault, a quiet archive of a time when attention made a difference. I visit sometimes when policy issues require my input. Its presence is a reminder that ordinary diligence, applied consistently, can return a system to health. It is also a reminder that power does not have to be theatrical to be dangerous. I am Liz Truman. I documented what needed documenting because the ledger demanded integrity. The world rarely rewards that kind of work with headlines. It rewards it with something drier but more dependable. Systems that do not let deception hide in plain sight. That will do.